In the final, desperate year of World War II, one of the most consequential American armies on the European front didn't actually exist. It was a phantom force, a mere 1,100 men strong, armed not with guns and steel, but with rubber, paint, giant speakers, and acting scripts. They were a secret fraternity of artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors, conscripted from the creative heart of America to fight a new kind of war. Their mission: to trick Hitler's legions on an industrial scale, to save an estimated 30,000 American lives, and then, as their final act, to vanish from the pages of history for more than half a century. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, and how they pulled off the greatest and quietest magic trick of the war. By the spring of 1944, World War II had entered its most brutal and decisive phase. The vast machinery of the Allied powers was coiling for the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. D-Day. The beaches of Normandy were about to become the epicenter of a global conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. The air across England was thick with the smell of coal smoke and exhaust fumes, the constant rumble of military convoys, a grim drumbeat counting down to invasion. In the stark, cold calculus of battle, Allied commanders knew the price for liberating Europe would be staggering. Every inch of French soil gained would be paid for in blood. The German war machine, though battered and stretched across multiple fronts, remained a formidable and deeply entrenched opponent, masters of defense, fortified behind the Atlantic Wall. The Allies were desperate for an edge, any edge, that could minimize their projected losses and deceive an enemy that was watching their every move with clinical precision. German reconnaissance planes crisscrossed the English coastline, their cameras capturing the immense buildup of men and material. The stakes could not have been higher. A single, well-placed German division could turn a beachhead into a slaughterhouse. A misplaced one could cede the continent. This was the terrifying puzzle facing the Allied High Command: how to be in two places at once. How could you convince the enemy you were poised to strike at Pas-de-Calais, the most logical and heavily defended point, when your real target was the sprawling, less defended coastline of Normandy? How do you make your army of 10,000 men look like an overwhelming force of 30,000, drawing enemy panzers away from the real fight? Military deception was, of course, as old as war itself, from the legendary Trojan horse to the feints and subterfuges of Sun Tzu. But this was the 20th century. Warfare had become a science of surveillance. With high-altitude aerial photography, sophisticated radio intercepts, and deeply embedded networks of spies, fooling the enemy now required creating an entirely believable, alternate reality, a full sensory illusion of war. The concept had been tested. Before the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa in 1942, the British had achieved a stunning success with Operation Bertram. Using plywood tanks, fake supply dumps, and cleverly disguised water pipelines, they misled German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel about the timing and location of their attack. They created a phantom army in the south, drawing precious enemy armor away from the true axis of assault in the north, paving the way for a decisive Allied victory. Inspired by this British triumph, a few forward-thinking American officers stationed in London began pushing a radical idea. The pair was an unlikely one. Colonel Billy Harris, a grounded, traditional West Point graduate, and Major Ralph Ingersoll, a celebrity journalist and best-selling author, described by the New York Times as a prodigiously energetic egotist. Working in the Special Plans branch, They envisioned a dedicated American unit whose only weapon was deception. What if the U.S. Army created a self-contained, mobile, multimedia unit that could conjure divisions out of thin air, manipulate enemy intelligence at will, and save thousands of lives without ever firing a shot in anger? It was an audacious, almost theatrical concept. They didn't just want to mislead the enemy. They wanted to stage a full-scale, traveling roadshow of war, complete with props, sound effects, and a cast of talented performers. The idea was so unconventional, it was almost laughed out of the deeply conservative rooms of the War Department. But in the desperate, high-stakes climate of 1944, with tens of thousands of American lives on the line, even the wildest ideas got a hearing. The proposal made its way up the chain of command, gathering momentum until it landed on the desks of the Pentagon's top brass. The decision was made. On January 20th, 1944, the U.S. Army secretly activated its own Phantom Force. This unit would be unlike any other in military history. It would be a secret weapon, a force multiplier, and a ghost. Officially, they were designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But to the small circle of men who served in it, they were, and always would be, the Ghost Army. Their mission was unprecedented: to impersonate other, much larger U.S. Army units to deceive the enemy about the size and location of Allied forces. With just 1,100 soldiers, they had to create the illusion of a 30,000-man force, the size of 2 full infantry divisions. To pull this off, they weren't looking for typical tough-as-nails soldiers. Instead, the Army sent recruiters to the most unlikely of places: art schools in New York and Philadelphia, advertising agencies on Madison Avenue, and the sound stages of Hollywood. They were hunting for painters, illustrators, architects, sound engineers, set designers, and actors. The unit was said to have one of the highest collective IQs in the Army, with an average of 119. The recruitment pitch was often cryptic and strange. One veteran, John Jarvie, a student at Pratt Institute, recalled an officer asking him, "Do you want to get shot at, or do you want to use your brain?" For young men who would rather wield a paintbrush than a rifle, it was a compelling offer. The men who signed up were an astonishing collection of talent. There was Sergeant Bill Blass from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Before the war, he was sketching fashion designs. After the war, he would build a global fashion empire. But in 1944, his eye for style and presentation was repurposed for military deception. Then there was Ellsworth Kelly, a quiet, introspective art student who would go on to become a celebrated pioneer of minimalist painting. In the Ghost Army, he studied and designed camouflage patterns, learning how to manipulate shape, color, and shadow not for a gallery, but to fool German reconnaissance pilots. Bernie Bluestein, another art student from Pratt Institute, found his skills in industrial design perfectly suited for the strange tasks of the visual deception unit. He would spend his war not designing products, but helping to create the illusion of an army, working with the strange new tools of deception. And there was Gilbert Seltzer, a promising young architect from New York. He recalled his introduction to the unit with a sense of foreboding. "We came to the conclusion that this was a suicide outfit," he remembered, realizing their job was to draw fire, not return it. Despite the danger, he signed up, trading his drafting table for the battlefields of France. These were the men of the Ghost Army, creatives, thinkers, and illusionists, now tasked with applying their artistic talents to the grim canvas of war. Their unit was built on 4 pillars of deception, each a masterpiece of ingenuity. First was visual deception. the domain of the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion. This was where the artists and designers like Blass, Kelly, and Bluestein were put to work. Their job was to create the physical presence of an army using rubber, not steel. They were equipped with hundreds of inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, and trucks. These were not crude balloons. Designed by Fred Patton at the U.S. Rubber Company and manufactured by a consortium that included Goodyear, they were built on a skeleton of inflatable tubes covered by a neoprene skin. A 93-pound inflatable Sherman tank, once pumped with air from a gasoline-powered compressor, became a startlingly accurate replica of its 32-ton counterpart. A team of just 4 men could inflate an entire platoon of tanks in under 30 minutes. They didn't stop there. They meticulously painted fake insignias on their real vehicles to impersonate specific divisions being simulated. They used bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the dirt roads to suggest heavy traffic. They even staged scenes of mundane daily life, like hanging laundry lines between inflatable trucks, all to convince any snooping German reconnaissance pilot that a real, functioning unit was encamped below. It was pure theater on a massive scale. The second pillar was sonic deception. A real army makes a hell of a lot of noise. This was the job of the 3,132nd Signal Service Company. These were the sound engineers, many recruited from radio stations and Hollywood studios. They traveled in specially armored half-tracks, each loaded with powerful speakers and a 500-pound amplifier system that could blast audio for miles. Their library was a symphony of warfare, with meticulously recorded sounds of Sherman tanks rumbling down a country road, pontoon bridges being constructed under pressure, officers barking orders, and the casual chatter of soldiers at rest. Under the cover of darkness, these sonic wizards would creep near the front lines, sometimes just a few hundred yards from the enemy, and play their recordings. They could make a lonely country road sound like an entire armored column on the move. The sound was so convincing, it didn't just fool the Germans. It often tricked nearby American GIs, who would frantically report hearing massive troop movements that simply weren't there. Third was radio deception, or spoof radio. In an era before satellites, radio traffic was a primary source of military intelligence. The enemy was always listening. The signal company created a phantom radio network that mimicked the chatter of the unit they were impersonating. Operators were specially trained to copy the distinct sending style, the fist, of other radio men, because to a trained German ear, a telegraphic fist was as unique as a fingerprint. They would transmit a constant stream of fake messages, coded orders, and mundane reports about their non-existent division's supply status or morale. They created a whole narrative over the airwaves, an electronic ghost that German intelligence, which prided itself on its sophisticated radio intercepts, fell for time and time again. The final pillar was what they called special effects, or sativ, atmosphere, the human element. The soldiers of the Ghost Army were, at their core, a traveling troupe of actors. To truly sell the con, they had to put on a performance. They would drive into recently liberated French towns in trucks bearing the counterfeit logos of the division they were pretending to be. They'd meticulously sew the wrong patches on their uniforms, a deeply dangerous act that could have gotten them shot as spies if captured. They'd hang out in local bars and cafes, talking loudly about their fake, upcoming offensive. Some men were chosen specifically for their acting chops to impersonate generals and colonels, driving around in staff cars to create the impression of a high-level command post and fool local collaborators who might be watching. This was easily the most dangerous part of their job. It required them to perform up close, often just miles from the front, for an unseen audience of enemy spies. One slip-up, one wrong word, and the whole show could come crashing down. Together, these four elements, visual, sonic, radio, and theatrical, were a powerful and unprecedented toolkit of illusion. The men of the Ghost Army were heading to the front lines, armed with rubber, sound waves, and pure imagination, ready to face down Hitler's legions with nothing but a grand performance. The Ghost Army arrived in Europe in waves just weeks after the D-Day landings in June 1944. From the bloody hedgerows of Normandy to the dark woods of the Hürtgen forest and the banks of the Rhine River, they would conduct more than 20 battlefield deceptions. Their traveling roadshow of war was about to begin. Their first test came in late August. The mission was codenamed Operation Elephant. American forces were preparing to assault the heavily fortified French port of Brest. The 23rd was tasked with a classic misdirection, making it appear as though a large American force was actually bypassing Brest and heading south toward Lorient. The goal was to draw German defenders away from the real target. The Ghost Army swung into action. They set up inflatable tanks where German spy planes were sure to see them. They drove a handful of trucks in endless loops to kick up clouds of dust, suggesting a massive convoy on the move. At night, the sonic team blasted their recordings of troop movements. Spoof radio operators broadcast messages indicating that the 6th Armored Division was heading south. The deception was a smashing success. German intelligence reports from the time confirm they believed a major American force was massing near Lorient. While the German command was distracted by this phantom army, the real American divisions attacked and captured Brest. The Ghost Army had proven its bizarre brand of warfare worked. Just a few weeks later, during the brutal Lorraine campaign, General George S. Patton's hard-charging Third Army was stretched dangerously thin. A yawning 70-mile gap in his line was being held by a single exhausted infantry division. If the Germans realized how weak that position was, they could punch right through and collapse Patton's flank. The Ghost Army was called in not to simulate an attack, but to create the illusion of a strong, reinforced line. For days, they filled the empty woods with inflatable tanks and the disembodied sounds of phantom patrols. They sent their atmosphere troops into nearby towns, posing as officers from multiple divisions and spreading rumors of a buildup. For several tense days, they held the line with nothing but rubber and noise. They were a scarecrow army, and the Germans, believing the front was heavily defended, never attacked. The Ghost Army had plugged a critical hole in the American line, almost certainly preventing a disaster. Their missions became bolder and more varied. In Raufertitan, Sauperwaschen Betemburg. In September 1944, they were tasked with making the Germans believe the 6th Armored Division had moved to a new sector in Luxembourg to cover a feint attack, drawing enemy artillery fire toward their fake positions while real troops moved undetected. Later, in the dark and bloody Hürtgen forest, they simulated the movement of the 75th Infantry Division, using sonic deception to cover their secret withdrawal from the line for a much-needed rest. With every mission, the soldiers got more creative and more acutely aware of the danger. They were often operating just miles from the front, sometimes within enemy artillery range. They were a unit of 1,100 men pretending to be 15,000 or more, meaning they had only a fraction of the firepower to defend themselves if caught. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed in action, and dozens were wounded. They were playing a high-stakes game of make-believe, but the bullets and shells were very real. As veteran Gilbert Seltzer remembered, "We were, in a sense, a moving target. We were always aware that our job was to be seen and to be heard, and that put us in a very vulnerable position. The culmination of all their work, their magnum opus, came in March of 1945. The Allies were at the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany. A frontal assault across the wide, fast-flowing river was expected to be a bloodbath, with casualties estimated in the tens of thousands. The High Command needed a miracle to draw German defenders away from the real crossing point. They needed the Ghost Army. This was Operation Viersen, their largest and most elaborate deception. The 9th U.S. Army was set to cross the Rhine in the north, in the 16th Corps zone. The Ghost Army's mission was to simulate a massive buildup by two entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry, for a fake Rhine crossing about 10 miles south of the actual location, in the 13th Corps zone near Düsseldorf. For 2 weeks, the 1,100 men of the 23rd put on the performance of a lifetime, impersonating a force of over 30,000. Day 1 to 5. The Arrival. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly, the deception began subtly. Phony radio networks crackled to life, broadcasting the arrival of the 30th and 79th Divisions into the assembly area. The operators mimicked the known radio fists of the division's actual signalmen. Convoys of trucks with the fake divisional patches of the 30th and 79th began rolling through the area, creating the impression of a major troop movement. Day 6 to 10. The buildup. The Visual Deception Unit went into overdrive. They deployed over 600 inflatable tanks, cannons, and vehicles in carefully chosen clearings, just visible enough for German reconnaissance planes. At night, they would deflate some of the dummies, move them, and inflate them in new positions to create the illusion of a massive force assembling in the darkness. The German Luftwaffe, noticing the activity, increased their reconnaissance flights. One Messerschmitt was seen overhead during the day, and more came at night, drawn to the deception like moths to a flame. Day 11 to 13. The Sounds of War. The sonic deception team began their assault on the enemy's ears. Night after night, they blasted recordings of pontoon bridge construction, the rumbling of armored columns, and the clang of engineering work. The sound was so realistic it was noted in the official logs of nearby British and American artillery units who believed a real crossing was being prepared. German artillery began to respond, shelling the area. The men of the Ghost Army would dive for cover, then emerge to find their only casualties were punctured rubber tanks, which they would patch up and re-inflate. Day 14. The Performance. In the final days, the atmosphere troops put on their show. Soldiers with the 30th and 79th Division patches crowded the local towns. Men posing as colonels and generals made themselves conspicuous in staff cars. They created a complete picture of an army preparing for a massive assault. The deception was flawless. German intelligence, which had meticulously tracked Allied movements, took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. Captured German intelligence maps and post-war analysis confirmed their fears. A German map of the American order of battle captured later showed the 79th Division placed exactly where the Ghost Army had portrayed it, and they had lost track of the 30th Division altogether. Convinced the main Allied attack was coming at Düsseldorf, the German High Command redirected crucial units, including elements of a powerful Panzer Division, to counter the phantom attack. On the night of March 23, 1945, while German forces were staring at an army of ghosts and bracing for an attack that would never come, the real U.S. 9th Army began its crossing 10 miles to the north. They were met with surprisingly light and disorganized resistance. The river crossing, which planners had feared would be a slaughter, was achieved with a fraction of the expected casualties. In some units, as few as 31 men. The Ninth Army's commander, General William Simpson, later issued a formal commendation, stating the deception had been a stunning success. Historians now estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions throughout the war saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. It was a masterpiece of military illusion, but the men who pulled it off would not be celebrated. As the war drew to a close, they were given one final order: disappear. When the war in Europe ended, the soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed up their inflatable tanks, dismantled their sound trucks, and went home. But they carried a heavy, invisible burden. Before being discharged, every single man was sworn to absolute secrecy. Their mission, they were told by their commanding officer, was so sensitive that it had to remain classified. They were ordered not to speak of it to anyone. Not their friends, not their wives, not their children, not even each other. The existence of the Ghost Army was to be denied. They were to take the story to their graves. And for the most part, they did. For nearly 50 years, one of the most remarkable and creative stories of World War II remained completely unknown. These men, who had fought a war of illusion, returned to civilian life and simply blended in. Bill Blass went on to build a fashion empire in New York. Ellsworth Kelly became a world-famous artist, his minimalist works hanging in the great museums of the world. Arthur Singer became a renowned wildlife illustrator. Art Kane became a legendary photographer. The others returned to quiet jobs in advertising, architecture, and design. They raised families, grew old, and held on to their secret. The silence was a profound weight. Veteran Anderson Wilson recalled joining his local VFW after the war. He would sit and listen to the other veterans share their stories of combat and camaraderie. But the secret classification of his mission meant he could never reciprocate. Unable to share in that fundamental veteran experience, he eventually stopped going. Wives and children never knew the full story. If asked what they did in the war, the men had a simple, unglamorous cover story. I was in an engineer unit. It was the truth, but only a tiny fraction of it. John Jarvie's children knew their father had been in the Army, but had no idea what he actually did until the mission was declassified. Another veteran's daughter recalled asking her mother about her father's service. "Oh, I don't think it was much," her mother replied, having only seen pictures of him smiling and playing cards, never knowing those were staged for public consumption. Imagine the psychological toll of that enforced silence. Imagine being part of something so incredible, so vital, and being unable to share it. Imagine watching a documentary about the battle for Brest or the crossing of the Rhine, knowing your deception saved thousands of lives, and hearing no mention of your unit's role. It was as if they had truly become ghosts. The silence finally began to crack in the mid-1980s. A few veterans, now in their 60s and 70s, cautiously began to reach out to one another. One of them, Arthur Shilstone, decided to test the waters by writing about his experiences for a local magazine. This small act of rebellion emboldened others. They began to feel their story was too important, too unique to be lost to history. They had kept their oath for 40 years. It was time for the world to know. They started a quiet but persistent campaign, writing letters to the Army and Congress, asking for their mission to be declassified. Finally, in 1996, the U.S. Army officially declassified the records of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. For the first time, the full, incredible scope of their mission was revealed to the public. It was a stunning revelation. Historians scrambled to rewrite the accounts of key European battles. Documentaries were produced and books were written, including the definitive work by Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales, which brought the story to a mass audience. The surviving members of the Ghost Army, now in their late 70s and 80s, could finally tell their stories. Children and grandchildren, who had only known their quiet, unassuming fathers and grandfathers, learned for the first time that they were part of a secret army of artists who had tricked the German High Command. The reemergence of their story was a powerful reminder that history is not always what it seems, and that the quietest heroes often have the most incredible tales to tell. Declassification in 1996 wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new fight, the fight for recognition. It quickly became clear that these soldiers had never been properly honored. Because their mission was top secret, they were ineligible for the commendations and medals that otherwise would have been awarded for their bravery and ingenuity. The men who fooled the German army, who put themselves in harm's way to save thousands of their comrades, came home with little more than a handshake and a lifelong gag order. For the next 25 years, a dedicated group of veterans, their families, and passionate historians, led by author and filmmaker Rick Beyer, through his Ghost Army Legacy Project, lobbied the U.S. government to give the Ghost Army its long-overdue formal recognition. They wrote countless letters, made endless calls, and met with members of Congress, tirelessly making the case for these unsung heroes. It was a long, often frustrating process. With each passing year, the number of surviving veterans dwindled. By 2020, fewer than a dozen of the original 1,100 were still alive. Time was running out. Then, finally, a breakthrough. The incredible story of the artist soldiers who used inflatable tanks to save their comrades captured the imagination of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. In 2022, Congress passed a bill to award the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and its sister unit, the 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special, the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor Congress can bestow upon a civilian or group. It was a monumental victory, decades in the making. On March 21, 2024, in a moving ceremony in Emancipation Hall at the U.S. Capitol, the medal was officially presented. By this time, only 3 of the Ghost Army veterans were still alive to see it. 100-year-old Bernie Bluestein, 100-year-old Seymour Nussenbaum, and 99-year-old John Christman. Bernie Bluestein was there in person to accept the honor on behalf of all the men who had served. Imagine that moment. A 100-year-old man who once wrestled with 93-pound rubber tanks on the battlefields of France, standing in the U.S. Capitol to receive the nation's highest gratitude, nearly 80 years after his service. Before the ceremony, the top military leaders of the nation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of the Army, and the Army Chief of Staff, knelt before the 3 elderly veterans to speak with them, a powerful image of respect paid across generations. House Speaker Mike Johnson captured the essence of their unique contribution, stating, "They were not just soldiers, they were artists, and actors, and engineers. They were creative and brilliant, and because of them, thousands of their brothers in arms came home." Senator Edward Markey added, "Their weapons were unconventional, but their patriotism was unquestionable." The legacy of the Ghost Army is about more than just a clever tactic. It's a story of human lives saved, of fathers, sons, and brothers who returned home because a German panzer division was sent chasing a ghost. It's a story about the unique intersection of art and war, a profound reminder that creativity, imagination, and ingenuity can be powerful forces even in the most brutal and destructive of human endeavors. Their story challenges our traditional notions of heroism. It shows that courage isn't just about charging into battle, it's also about having the nerve to crawl near the front lines in the dead of night to play a sound recording, knowing a single stray shell could end your performance forever. Their long overdue recognition ensures that this phantom army will no longer be a ghost in the pages of history. They will be remembered as a secret weapon, a regiment of artists, and a band of American heroes who saved thousands of lives with the greatest magic trick of the war. The story of the Ghost Army is a powerful reminder that some of history's greatest heroes are the ones we've never heard of. If you found this story as incredible as we did, let us know in the comments what other secret missions or unsung heroes from history deserve to have their story told.